Imagine you're standing by the riverbank, listening to the gentle babbling of flowing water, when suddenly an elderly hand emerges from the stream, desperately clinging to a tree branch as if trying to hold on to life itself. This is the true story of Frank Wilson, a 78-year-old man who had spent his entire life caring for his small plot of land. But what he never could have imagined was that his own daughter, the person he loved most in this world, would be the one to push him into that freezing river. Everyone thought he was dead. Even his daughter held a fake funeral, weeping in front of the neighbors. But Frank Wilson came back. She's sharing from the heart. If someone is still listening, leave a 4 to show her someone still cares. And when he appeared in that meeting room that day, those who had once wanted to bury him were stunned, as if they had seen a ghost. So, how did he manage to survive? Why did his own daughter betray her father? And what happened when a man presumed dead walked in to sign the house sale contract? Join me in listening to this deeply moving and surprising story. I guarantee that the ending will bring you to tears and leave you reflecting profoundly on the meaning of selflessness, betrayal, and the ability to rise again after life's hardest blows. Before we start, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Try to watch the videos as long as possible. By watching more often, YouTube will promote these stories to a larger audience, grow your channel, and bring you more interesting things. Let's start now. Water filled his mouth and lungs like cruel punishment, while his arms tried uselessly to grab onto something, anything. Branch, a rock, a miracle. The initial blow clouded his senses, but didn't extinguish them. He felt every second of his sinking like an eternity, the cold that chilled him to the bone, the darkness surrounding him like a closed veil, the dull roar of water that gave no respite. His thoughts mixed with images from the past-off April as a child, of laughter among trees, of nights under star sand. Amid all that, a certainty began to grow in his chest. He wasn't going to surrender. Not like this. On the shore, April couldn't bear to watch anymore. As soon as she saw her father submerge and disappear among the agitated waters, she turned her face toward the forest, closed her eyes tightly and gritted her teeth until it hurt. An icy weight fell on her shoulders as if gravity itself forced her to bow before guilt. Her hands trembled, and in her throat formed a dry knot she couldn't untie. She felt nauseous, not from what she had seen, but from what she had allowed. She thought of running to the water, of screaming, of throwing herself after him. But she didn't move. She remained motionless, as if her feet had melted with the earth. Inside, her soul battled between the instinct to save her father and absolute fear of confronting James. She told herself there was no turning back, that it was too late, that what was done was done. But in reality, she didn't want to face what she had allowed. She clenched her fists and felt nails dig into her palms, minimal pain compared to what burned inside. James, on the other hand, observed the river with the calm of someone finishing a pending task. He ran his hands over his pants, carelessly cleaning some drops of water and dirt that had splashed during the fall. With the same voice he used to close a deal or give an order on the phone, he said they were now free, that they could finally start anew without burdens, without others' guilt, without ghosts from the past. He looked at the river and said maybe they had even done him a favor. Then he turned to April and asked if she was okay. though his tone showed no real concern, only fulfillment of an emotional protocol. She didn't respond. She couldn't. At that moment, her body was there by the water, but her mind was elsewhere, in a mixture of pain, doubt, and emptiness she couldn't fully understand. James's words turned her stomach. She felt she was losing something more than her father. She was losing herself. In the distance, the forest sound resumed its usual song, as if everything were part of the natural cycle, as if crimes and guilt dissolved among trunks and stones. But something very subtle broke the false harmony of that scene. Among the bushes further down, where the river made an unexpected turn and current slowed by a group of mossy rocks, a small movement interrupted the stillness. A branch trembled, not from wind, but from a hand that had grabbed it desperately. It was barely a gesture, an almost imperceptible touch. But there it was, an aged, pale, wounded fist emerging from water, clinging with the strength only those who refuse to give up possess. Frank, battered, gasping between coughs and pain, had managed to float to a less aggressive area of the river. Blood ran down his forehead. An open wound pulsed at his temple, but his eyes remained open, now filled with quiet fury, with iron will he hadn't shown in years. His agitated but clear mind repeated a single phrase that kept him awake. This wasn't how his story would end. With each labored breath, with each spasm of pain in his chest, Frank repeated to himself that he still had something to say, something to show, something to recover. The river had wanted to take him, but he hadn't surrendered yet. Not while the world believed he was dead, not while his daughter lived under that man's control. With what little strength remained, he dragged himself among stones and roots, hiding in the vegetation shadows while life began to return to his body like embers slowly reigniting. Frank's body, covered in mud, dried blood, and leaves stuck by humidity, slid slowly along the river's rocky shore, like a piece of forgotten history refusing to sink. His swollen, scratched hands clung stubbornly to the old trunk of a fallen willow, whose slippery bark offered barely minimum support. He breathed with difficulty, as if air struggled to cross his bruised chest, and each inspiration was a battle between pain and will to stay alive. The current had dragged him farther than he imagined, and though he didn't know with certainty how many minutes or perhaps hours she had spent unconscious among river eddies, he knew he shouldn't stop. Water still dripped from his clothes like tears from an exhausted body, and his eyes barely stayed open, heavy from the head blow, from cold, from fatigue accumulating in his bones like mud under fingernails. He murmured something incomprehensibly a plea, perhaps, or a directionless prayer while dragging his body among roots and stones, seeking shelter, a sign, something to tell him not everything was lost. A few meters ahead, hidden among wild vegetation and cliffs formed by years of erosion and oblivion, appeared a hole between two large stones, covered with moss and shadows. It seemed like a natural grotto or cave, barely wide enough to shelter from wind. Frank saw it like someone seeing a lighthouse amid shipwreck, and with his last strength, impulse let himself fall inside. The floor was cold but dry, covered with dry leaves and branches that creaked under his weight. He lay with difficulty against one of the rocky walls and closed his eyes, feeling pain slide through his body like a rough blanket. The cave's silence was deep, interrupted only by the soft tapping of water still dripping from his clothes and the echo of his labored breathing. In that instant, Frank's body surrendered to exhaustion and his mind slowly faded like a candle resisting death. He fell into deep, almost sinister sleep where past images mixed with present darkness. He remembered April as a child running through the field, laughing among wildflowers. He remembered her voice calling him Daddy, with that innocence now seeming so distant. He remembered the betrayal and then nothing. Time passed without measure inside that grotto, until a subtle, almost imperceptible noise broke the place's quiet. Slow, dragging steps accompanied by the metallic sound of a bucket hitting something. An older, thin man with face weathered by sun and years stopped at the cave entrance. His name was Luke Miller, and he was known by few in the region as a solitary fisherman who lived downstream in a small shack made with recycled wood and tin roof. No one knew much about him except that he spent days casting his net into water and talking alone as if he carried inside more stories than he could tell. That morning, he had gone out early to check his traps when he saw strange tracks on the shore, broken branches, bloodstains, traces of a dragged body. Following the instinct only those who have lived in nature possess, he walked to the grotto and found Frank motionless, covered in wounds, with pale face and dry lips. He approached cautiously, crouched beside him, and touched his neck with 2 fingers. There was pulse, weak but real. Then he murmured in low voice that the river hadn't wanted him, that maybe he still had something pending in this life. Frank woke hours later, wrapped in improvised blankets made from fabric scraps and large leaves. The smell of fish and smoke reached him first, then light. Opening his eyes, he saw a man sitting before a small fire, stirring the contents of a metal pot. His head hurt as if 1,000 hammers struck from within, but he managed to sit up just a few centimeters, enough to emit a hoarse whisper. Barely a thread of voice asking where he was. The man turned slowly, looked at him with a tranquil smile, and said he was safe, that he had found him half dead among stones and roots, and had to carry him like a sack of potatoes. Then he added, while offering him a cup with hot liquid, that the river hadn't wanted to take him, that this meant something, that maybe life hadn't finished with him yet. Frank observed him with distrust at first, but in that stranger's eyes was a peace difficult to fake. He took the cup with trembling hands, sipped some of the broth, and felt for the first time in a long while a warmth that didn't come from fire, but from hope. Luke introduced himself without giving too many details, only said he fished to live, had no family, and didn't ask questions that didn't need answers. Then he told him to rest, that there would be time to talk, and turned again toward the pot, humming an old melody like the river. Frank closed his eyes, this time not from exhaustion, but from gratitude, and while fire crackled softly, he understood that maybe, just maybe, destiny's current hadn't finished writing his story. For 3 weeks. Frank drifted between consciousness and fevered dreams, Luke's primitive medical care cleaning wounds with river water and applying mud poultices barely kept infection at bay. When Frank finally could sit up without dizzy spells, nearly a month had passed. His body bore permanent scars, a limp in his left leg, reduced hearing in one ear, and hands that shook when he was tired. Yet somehow he had gained something in tow, kind of sharp lucidity, a deeper connection with silence, with earth, with time itself, a kind of sharp lucidity, a deeper connection with silence, with earth, with time itself. He slept on an improvised bed of sacks and worn blankets, surrounded by the smell of river, old wood, simple life, during mornings. Luke went fishing while he struggled to move his body, to walk again with firm steps. One morning, after a particularly long night of insomnia and thoughts, Frank decided to leave the cabin and explore the surroundings a bit. He leaned on an improvised walking stick Luke had carved from a eucalyptus branch, and with slow steps descended a small slope that led him back to the river, right to a curve where waters formed a tranquil backwater. There, among humid rocks and moss, shining with filtered sunlight, something caught his attention. He bent with difficulty, bringing his sight closer, and saw golden glimmers trapped between stone cracks. He first thought they were just sun reflections, a play of light on water. But when he touched those particles with his fingers and felt their hardness and weight, he understood this wasn't an illusion. It was gold, real gold. Frank remained silent for a moment, fingers covered by that golden dust, and felt a mixture of amazement and distrust. It was too strange, too improbable. He looked around as if expecting someone else to have seen the same, but there was no one, only the eternal, indifferent river following its course as if it didn't hide secrets. He returned to the cabin later with accelerated heart and trembling hands, and when Luke returned with a couple of fish hanging from wire, he showed him what he had found. Luke observed the fragments with attention, rubbed them between fingers, even bit them, and then said, with grave voice, that yes, it was gold ancient, very ancient, probably from mines abandoned more than half a century ago when the government closed access due to cave-ins and accidents. He told that he had heard stories from old miners who said the river still carried small traces of metal, but no one had ever found a vein so close, so clear. He said it was a dangerous find. That gold was more curse than blessing if it fell into wrong hands. Frank listened in silence, sitting before the fire, feeling how life once again gave him a second chance, but this time with a powerful weapon that could change everything. They spent hours talking. Luke asked what he would do with what he had found, and Frank responded he didn't know yet, that he didn't want gold to become rich, wasn't seeking luxuries or revenge, but he did want justice, dignity, to close a cycle that had been violently and treacherously stolen from him. He said he didn't want to leave this world being just a forgotten old man, that he still had something to tell, to teach, to correct. Luke, with his silent wisdom, put a hand on his shoulder and told him they should then keep the secret, use it wisely, not let greed ruin everything. He proposed they work in silence, collecting little by little, carefully, without raising suspicions. Frank nodded. They made a simple but profound pact. They wouldn't speak to anyone, wouldn't share the discovery until the right moment, and what they obtained, they would use to repair what life had taken from them. In that instant, Frank felt the river that had once tried to kill him now offered him something more than gold. It offered redemption. That same night, while fire crackled, listening in silence, Frank took out an old notebook Luke had offered him, one of those with hard cardboard covers and pages yellowed by time. He took a pencil and began to write with large letters, clumsy at first due to his fingers' stiffness, but with soul ignited inside. He wrote that his story hadn't ended, that someone had tried to close it for him, but now he was the one holding the pen. He wrote about his daughter, about James, about working days on the land, about solitude, about the river's blow, and also about gold not as treasure, but as symbol, as echo of something buried that could still be reborn. Each word he wrote was a brick in his reconstruction. Luke watched him from his corner without interrupting, knowing some battles are fought in ink's silence. Outside, the river continued its course, but it was no longer the same. Now, among its stones, it guarded a secret shared by two men life had dragged, but destiny had crossed for something greater than themselves. While the river continued its silent course, and Frank, in a cabin hidden among vegetation, rebuilt his body and spirit with the patient strength of one who has returned from the abyss. At the other end of town, life appeared to continue normally, though under a mask carefully placed by those who had committed a betrayal too great to be named. April walked through streets with sorrowful face, dressed in dark colors, with deliberately dimmed eyes to avoid raising suspicions. She greeted neighbors with calculated sadness and repeated over and over that her father had mysteriously disappeared during a walk, that they searched for days. But the river doesn't return what it takes, Tess. Some townspeople consoled her with soft words. Others looked at her with distrust. But no one said anything. In small communities, rumors run faster than water. But silence also weighs more than truth. James, always skillful with words, gave short interviews point blank. He said they were devastated, that police had done what they could, that it was a tragedy, one of those things that happen and no one can explain. He even had flyers printed with Frank's photo in black and white and pasted them on some posts as if that were enough to clean the trace of what he had done. Were old, unupdated deeds, accumulated municipal debts, rural taxes unpaid for years. Officials demanded papers they didn't have, signatures they couldn't forge without running risks. James began losing his temper. He argued with April behind closed doors, reproached her for not having convinced her father to sell while alive, yelled that they had done it for her, for both of them. And now, they were trapped in legal mess. April, increasingly thin and absent, no longer responded with the same conviction. She spent hours sitting in the old living room chair, looking at the door her father always used, as if still expecting to see him enter with his hat and dragging step. In her mind, Frank's face appeared over and over, but not as a vengeful ghost, but as a wound that wouldn't close. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice was barely an echo of what it had been. James noticed her distant, but attributed it to guilt. He, on the other hand, was determined to take advantage of any opportunity that arose to profit from what he already considered his. It was amid this growing tension that an elegant lawyer appeared, gray suit and leather briefcase, who presented himself at the house one cloudy afternoon. He said he represented an international company interested in acquiring the property for a high-level ecological project. He brought a formal proposal with detailed figures, a sum of money higher than James could have imagined. Upon hearing the terms, his eyes shone with poorly disguised greed. The lawyer explained the company wanted to sign the contract as soon as possible, but for legal reasons they needed the owner's signature, and therefore required verifying all documentation, including the physical presence of the owner or, failing that, an official death certificate. James tried to disguise his annoyance. He responded that Mr. Frank was missing, that everyone in town knew it, that the river had swallowed him and there was no body to recover. The lawyer nodded courteously, but said that wasn't sufficient to close an operation of that size. That law required certain steps, certain times. April, who was listening from the doorframe, felt a chill run down her spine. The mention of the word signature, the possibility someone might discover what really happened, made her tremble. In her head, James's words that night by the river resonated with more force than ever. Do you want to see him suffer until death? Or do you want to free him? The following days were a race against time. James contacted notaries, tried to move influences, offered money under the table, but nothing seemed to advance. Without the original signature, the sale was stagnant, and his frustration began overflowing in the form of screams, threats, heavy silences. One afternoon, when he believed everything was lost, he received a call. The lawyer wanted to organize a final meeting in person directly with the owner. James exploded. He yelled it was impossible, that this was disrespectful. The lawyer, with the patience of one who knows more than he says, responded. There was new information, something unexpected, that it would be better if both he and April presented themselves at least to clarify some points. The meeting was set for the next day in a nearby city office. April, pale as a sheet of paper, asked what this meant. James, with face hardened by tension, responded it was surely a strategy to lower the price, that she shouldn't worry, that he would handle everything. But what neither James nor April knew was that far from there, in a place where the river murmured hidden truths among stones and trees, a man everyone believed dead was about to stand up. Frank, with hair whiter than ever but gaze alive like contained fire, was trying on a suit Luke had found carefully stored in an old trunk. It was dark gray, sober, elegant. Looking at himself in the broken mirror leaning against the cabin wall, Frank didn't see himself as an elderly man, but as a witness of time, as someone who had crossed death's threshold and returned not for revenge, but to write the end of his story with his own hands. He closed the jacket button, breathed deeply, and said it was time. Time to return. Time to sign. Time to look in the eyes of those who had given him up for dead. While adjusting his shirt cuffs, he added in low voice that some return with the current, but others return with purpose. The meeting room was wrapped in heavy atmosphere, as if the air itself knew something out of the ordinary was about to happen. Glass walls polished to the extreme reflected opaque light entering through cloudy sky. And on the main table, documents were perfectly aligned like soldiers in formation. April and James sat next to each other, but the emptiness between them was as evident as if kilometers separated them. She kept hands together on her lap, knuckles white from pressure, face pale, eyes fixed on the floor, as if fearing that raising her gaze might make some dark presentiment real. James, on the other hand, showed barely disguised restlessness behind his well-pressed shirt and fitted jacket. He drummed on the table impatiently, checked his wristwatch every minute and murmured it was time already, that he didn't understand why that lawyer made them wait so long if everything was already agreed upon. The lawyer, a man of low voice and measured smile, barely said they should wait for the final buyer, that there was one last pending formality. No one in the room could imagine what was about to happen, and even less were they prepared for the image that would soon burst into that bureaucratic routine like a blow of truth thrown on the table. Outside, the subtle noise of an engine caught everyone's attention. A black car with tinted windows stopped right in front of the building entrance. From it descended a man with firm bearing, dark gray suit, and dark glasses that hid his gaze, but not his presence. Frank had spent 2 weeks preparing for this moment. Luke helped him practice walking without his limp showing, coached him on legal terminology, and most importantly, helped him contact the mining company that had been secretly monitoring gold deposits in the area for months. The lawyer was their representative, and Frank's survival combined with his mineral right shad shifted all negotiations in his favor. The sound of his shoes on marble resonated with solemn echo in the hallway, and when he crossed the meeting room door, time seemed to stop. April raised her gaze and her eyes opened wide, as if the universe had just broken before her. James. Recognizing the face he believed he had buried, not underground, but underwater, paled with such intensity that for an instant he stopped breathing. He tried to stand, but his legs failed. His body collapsed with a dry thud against the floor, and assistants ran to help him while the lawyer, impassive, only turned the documents with measured elegance and said, now they could continue because the legitimate owner had arrived. Frank said not a word upon entering. He slowly removed his glasses and stored them in his jacket's inner pocket, revealing eyes that were no longer those of the resigned elderly man who once cared for his garden in silence, but those of a man who had returned from the abyss with something more than life with dignity. He sat before everyone with serenity that unsettles, as if not a single day had passed since the last time someone saw him. The lawyer slid the contract across the table with a slight movement, and while offering him the pen, said they were ready to close the purchase if he authorized it. Frank took the pen with firm hands without hesitating, and while signing his name with steady strokes, said that sometimes what is thrown to the river returns with more value. That there are things not buried so easily that water can drag a body, but not a story. No one in the room breathed. April cried silently, eyes fixed on her father, as if still doubting whether this was a miracle or punishment. James, now seated with 2 assistants' help, murmured between teeth that this was impossible, that it had to be a setup. But his voice was barely a broken whisper from fear. Frank stood slowly once the document was signed, and said he hadn't returned for revenge, that the gold found in the river wasn't the true treasure he brought with him, but the certainty he still had something to teach. He said he didn't seek punishment, but ending, that life charges everyone their due, and it had returned to him something many lose forever. The right to close his own story with dignity. The lawyer thanked with a slight nod. Documents were collected, and while Frank left through the same door he had entered, no one dared say another word. Only April, trembling, half stood and whispered that she was sorry, that she didn't know how to say no, that everything got out of her hands. He looked at her for a long moment, without harshness, but without softness, and responded that the river doesn't hold grudges, but doesn't forget either. Then he left without looking back, leaving in that room not just a signature, but an indelible mark of something the modern world fails to understand: the power of the impossible. The old house door creaked, as if recognizing the footsteps slowly approaching from the dirt path, as if the wood, dormant from time and abandonment, knew that he who approached was not a stranger, but its legitimate owner, its living memory. Frank stopped before the rusty gate, pushed it gently, and saw it open without resistance, as if it had been waiting for him. He carried in his right hand a dark leather folder containing documents that now returned to him not just the house, but the history they had tried to erase. He crossed the threshold with slow but firm step, his eyes touring every corner as if dialoguing with memories hanging on walls, with aromas hidden under dust, with invisible echoes of a life that had been his and they had wanted to snatch away. The air inside was dense, mixed between humidity, abandonment, and silence. On the dining table still sat the glass where he used to drink water each morning, as if time had stopped waiting for his return. Light entered through half-open windows, cut by dirty curtains, projecting long shadows that seemed to observe him in silence. April appeared from the hallway's end, barefoot, with face distorted by surprise and guilt. As if she had just seen a ghost she didn't know how to bury. Her lips parted, but she said nothing immediately. She walked toward him slowly, knees weak, hands trembling, and when she was a few steps away, she couldn't resist. She fell to her knees on the wooden floor, eyes fixed on her father's, and tried to speak, but words wouldn't organize. She barely managed to articulate with broken voice. "Dad, But before she could continue, Frank gently raised his hand in a pause gesture, not authoritarian, but serene, like someone who doesn't need to hear more because they already know everything. His gaze wasn't of hatred or reproach, but of ancient, resigned sadness, as if disappointment had been absorbed by the river, and now only space remained for what needed to be said. He didn't yell, didn't throw accusations, didn't dig up wounds. He simply looked at her deeply and said he hadn't returned to settle accounts, that he wasn't seeking punishment, revenge, tears, or explanations. He said he had returned because life cycles shouldn't be left open like wounds, that he needed to close the door with his own hands, not with others' hands. James appeared seconds later, coming downstairs with a mixture of wounded arrogance and poorly disguised nervousness. He tried to speak, ask what all this meant, say they had rights, that they couldn't be evicted like this. But Frank interrupted him with his gasia, gaze so firm it was enough to make him shut up instantly. Frank opened the leather folder and placed on the table the notarial documents, the deeds, the legal resolution recognizing him again as sole owner. He said everything was in order. There was nothing to discuss, and that chapter should end now. He walked toward April, who still remained on her knees, and extended her a sealed envelope with both hands. He said inside was enough money to start anew. Far from there. That it wasn't a prize or reward, but an opportunity. The envelope contained exactly $50,000 money that would cover their debts and provide a modest, fresh start, but nothing close to the fortune they had imagined from selling the property. It was enough to survive, not enough to thrive, which Frank felt was appropriate justice. He asked them to leave, to let that land rest in peace, not to try to return, not because he demanded it with hatred, but because he had understood that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but liberating. And the only thing he could offer them now was that freedom to remake their lives far from what they destroyed. April took the envelope without saying a word. Tears fell down her face in silence, not expecting understanding, but accepting she had lost something that would never return. James, muted, had no choice but to step back. He knew he had no power left, that everything had slipped away like sand through fingers. Frank turned and walked to the door. Before crossing it, he stopped for a second, turned his head, and said that house didn't need more empty voices, that memory couldn't be bought or destroyed, and that some roots, even when cut, remain alive underground, waiting for the right moment to sprout again. Then he went out into the evening sun, closing the door behind him with quiet peace that didn't need applause or witnesses, because true justice, that of the soul, never makes noise. But as Frank walked down the familiar path, he felt the weight of what he'd done. The money he'd given April came from the mining company's advance payment money that would eventually destroy this very land he'd fought to protect. He had won the battle for his dignity, but perhaps lost the war for his home. Sometimes justice, he realized, comes with prices no one expects to pay. Frank had made an impossible choice. To gain justice for himself, he had to sacrifice the very thing he'd spent his life protecting. The irony wasn't lost on him. In saving his dignity, he had condemned his home. As he walked away down the same path where years ago he saw his daughter leave, wind moved the walnut tree branches as if applauding his return, not as hero, but as man who decided not to leave his story in anyone else's hands. The breeze ran soft that afternoon, caressing the river's surface with the same delicacy with which a mother combs her sleeping child's hair. Willow leaves swayed slowly, as if listening to silence and accompanying it in its tranquil movement. On water's edge, two figures remained seated on flat stones with stretched legs and fishing rods resting in humid mud. Luke, with hat pushed back, smoked a thin cigarette he had rolled himself with dry leaves and old tobacco, while Frank, with faded gray cap and serene face, held the rod with one hand and with the other, passed fingers over his notebook's rough surface. That notebook had become, for weeks, a life diary, a soul map, the only place where he could store what spoken words weren't capable of sustaining. Neither said anything. There was no need. Between them existed silent complicity born not from shared time, but from lived pain and the way both had learned to look at the world after having lost almost everything. The river spoke to them with its constant murmur, and they responded with the quietude of those who no longer need explanations. Frank leafed through pages slowly, observing his own handwriting as if it were another man's own younger, one who hadn't yet been betrayed or pushed into death's cold waters. He had written everything: childhood memories, scenes with his daughter, descriptions of dawns from his garden, thoughts about gold found among stones, and reflections on love's fragility when mixed with ambition. Each page was a fragment of his soul, a way to order the chaos that had shaken him. Luke, without looking at him, asked if he thought of publishing it someday. Frank responded. He didn't know. Maybe yes. Maybe no. But the important thing wasn't that others read it, but that he himself could remember what he lived without it escaping like water through fingers. He said writing was like sowing gone doesn't know if the seed will grow, but plants it with hope anyway. Luke nodded silently and threw his cigarette to the ground, crushing it with his boot sole before looking again at the river as if all life's answers were there. As afternoon began tilting toward sunset, with orange tones painting sky and reflecting on water like a mirror guarding sun's memories, a small figure appeared running down the dirt path connecting the village to the river. It was a boy no more than 9 years old with bare feet, clothes dirty from playing, and eyes so open they seemed like 2 newborn moons. He stopped a few meters from the 2 men and looked at them with curiosity, with that natural respect children feel for elders who seem to know things no one else knows. He remained silent for seconds, then approached a bit more, looking directly at Frank. He asked with soft but firm voice if it was true he was the man who had returned from the river, the one everyone said had gone forever, and one day appeared again. Different, with a strange shine in his eyes. Frank looked at him silently, with a smile that wasn't of pride or vanity, but of deep humility. those that only exist when one has understood the true value of what they have. He responded he hadn't returned alone, that he had come back with destiny's current, that sometimes the river doesn't drag, but returns what the world wanted to lose. He said the river taught him there are things that don't sink, no matter how much they want to bury them. The boy didn't understand completely, but nodded as if he did, as children do when they know words aren't important, but what you feel when hearing them. Then he sat beside him and asked if he could watch how they fished. Frank handed him another rod. Luke had left aside and told him yes, that learning to wait was one of life's most difficult but also most beautiful things. Luke laughed with that low, hoarse chuckle he used when something truly touched him, and said if the boy had patience, maybe the river would also teach him a couple of secrets. The sun kept going down, painting everything gold, and for an instant, everything seemed at peace. Life, like the river, continued its course. But this time, Frank knew he wouldn't let himself be dragged. He had learned to swim with his soul, and now, with a notebook on his lap and a new story beside him, he understood that even what breaks can flow again. It just takes time, truth, and a little silence. This is the story of Frank Wilson, a man who was once betrayed, who once sank into the darkness of being forgotten, but then still stood up, stronger and clearer than before. The river has spoken to us. Life has raised its voice, and destiny has whispered in its own unique way. Life isn't always smooth, but it's precisely these upheavals that teach us how to listen to ourselves, rediscover true value, and understand that wounds are not the end. They are where we begin our journey of resurrection. Sometimes, to move forward, we don't need to forget the past, but simply learn to look at it with serenity. Every fall is a reminder that we are still alive and still have the opportunity to choose a different path, a path leading toward the light. Now, I want to listen to you. What in today's story touched you the most? Have you ever experienced a river of life like Frank? And do you believe that, after everything, we can still be reborn in our own very unique, very real way? Please share in the comments, because the words you write could also be light for someone who is lost. On this channel, there are many more stories about people, about resilience, about hope, and healing. Each video is a door opening to a different perspective on life. If you feel touched, if you feel understood, please continue this journey with me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any story. Because who knows, someday, just one sentence could change your life. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with your whole heart. See you in the next story where the flow of life continues. But now, we will swim together, no longer alone.